celebration of the 100-year anniversary, the Chinese Communist Party released a white paper on human rights. And it said they have the best human rights.
Yeah, because, everybody's universal human rights are definitely universal, but every country interprets them in a different way.
Yeah, that was how they did it. And they defined it as like subsistence, and I forget the other word.
Development.
Development, economic development. So as long as the party lifts people out of poverty, no mention of how they kind of changed the definition of poverty, as long as that's the case, then they're providing the best human rights, because also they're providing human rights to more people because they have a fifth of the world's population.
I'm really glad we now have the podcast on video on YouTube so people can see the quotation marks that you just did.
Can't people hear the quotation marks? Well, no, it's like, human rights or human rights, the second one had quotation marks around it.
Okay, yeah.
But at any rate, yeah, so that definition, like no other country can have better human rights, because if China provides it to a fifth of the world's population, then no country can be more than that, because no country has a bigger population.
And this is a great example of why the Chinese Communist Party is in an ideological war with the United States. Essentially what the Chinese Communist Party is saying is, we have our definition of human rights. You can have yours. Just don't force your values on us. And to a lot of people, that sounds reasonable. You don't want, other cultures, other people forcing their beliefs on you. But if you look at what's happening to the Uyghurs, that's evil. If you look at the organ harvesting of Falun Gong, that's evil. Everything the Chinese Communist Party has done in the past 100 years to the Chinese people is evil. And this is why the United States is such a threat to the Chinese Communist Party, because in the foundation upon which the United States is built on is the idea that human rights are not something meted out by committee. They are inalienable rights that are bestowed, that are a fundamental part of human existence given by the creator or nature. These are the words the founding father are using, but that they are something transcendent, not something that a government can choose to give or not to give. And this is the biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party, that there are unchangeable truths.
Well, we may hold these truths to be self-evident, but I don't think the Chinese Communist Party sees them as self-evident, because they believe ideologically that rights come from them.
In the Chinese Constitution, it's essentially that you have these rights as long as they don't go against the interests of the state.
Right. I mean, I think, you bring up the U.S. founding fathers and this idea that rights come from the creator, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Also, it's interesting the context in which the Declaration of Independence was written, right? It's like you had a sort of elite group of intelligent, well-educated men in the American colonies. And, okay, you're giving me that look, because yes, there's some things that are problematic and some of them were slave owners, but that's true. That's not the direction I want to go in. But the point is that they were these very intelligent, educated men who were feeling that they were oppressed by an even greater, eliter, more powerful group, which was the British king, the English king.
The group that was the English king.
That's why they say we.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so.
Okay. Well, I understand. It actually was Parliament, but they, for political reasons, didn't want to say it.
Okay. Thank you for being accuracy ninja. The point is that you had people who had this ability to create a new system who were themselves feeling this sort of yoke of oppression. And so that's kind of where their whole rights can't be given by the crown or by the king or by parliament, right? Rights come from the creator, and thereby are able to sort of define what human rights or rights ought to be, because they weren't people in power. Because people in power typically are I'm happy to give you some rights, but they're for me. And so you now had rights being defined by people who were not in power. And by not being in power, they were representing the vast majority of people in a way that people in power are never representing the vast majority of people.
That is the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The French Revolution was basically a proto-communist revolution, where everything still came from the state. I don't know if the state is the right word for that, what that revolution put into power. But it is also a fundamental difference between how the United States looks at human rights and pretty much every other country on the planet. Most European countries don't look at it like this. They talk about human rights, they talk about freedom of speech, but it's still not something, they don't talk about it as if it's a transcendent, inalienable thing.
Well,
Right.
I don't know if that's true because essentially I think you would have British people, for example, talking about how the Magna Carta was essentially, in a lot of ways, that for them.
The Magna Carta was the first type of restriction on
The absolute
power of the monarch.
Yeah. But I mean, like France, for example, has freedom of speech. I'm using quotes again.
For everyone listening on podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify.
So while France has freedom of speech, it's also in a little bit like China in that your freedom of speech is only guaranteed insofar as you don't infringe on national interests, right? And so after the Yellow Vest protests a couple of years ago, like the French police arrested thousands of people for protesting and charged them because they can do that under French law, right? Whereas in the US, like no matter what horrible things you might say about the government or like the most like, obscene, terrible things you say in a protest, like you still have actual freedom of speech as long as you're not, violent, for example. And so the U.S. could have never done to completely peaceful protesters what the French government was easily able to do under their own laws, which is to say France is less free than the United States.
Similar restrictions exist in Germany. New Zealand is a great example of this. New Zealand.
Well, they have like a
classification office, and the head of that is called the chief censor.
Yeah.
So, the American view on human rights is unique in the world, which I think is one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party is so invested in an ideological war against the U.S. In particular, because I feel it is this American ideology that has made the U.S. so successful. It has created a system of prosperity for the world that is a challenge to the Chinese Communist Party model, which is why we see the Communist Party trying to develop this alternative system to supplant what the United States has created.
I mean, I don't think they could have done it, essentially, until now. They always did not like relying on the U.S. or Western systems, but they basically made a calculation that they couldn't really go up against it, economically especially.